So many times when I'm attempting to find the sort of archetypes that I want to discuss in these videos, I go to the comments. And usually I will pick the comments that are most frequent, you know, the most amount of people talking about the same trope. So obviously they're the most excited about that. But this one came from something specific. I saw a comment asking about what it was like to play the last of your kind. Somebody who is literally the last of whatever kind they are, whether it be a specific class, whether it be a race, a subclass, etc.
Destined for what? I set out to find my destiny.
And despite that not seemingly being a very exciting trope for most of the comments, I found that very interesting. For one specific reason, this is a very common trope. Think about series like Avatar: The Last Airbender, or Dragon Ball Z, or Superman, or, well, okay, honestly, you could probably go on a very large list, but the point is, having somebody who is the last of their kind is a very common trope, but I don't think I have ever seen it played in D&D, which made it very interesting. I started to think about why that might be, and I found a few different examples. But before we get fully into that, we should talk about what the trope is exactly. I mean, obviously the archetype is pretty clearly cut and dry. It is the last of your kind.
She may be the last unicorn.
All I want to know is if you've seen other unicorns like me somewhere in the world.
But there is more to it. Like I said, they're typically the last of their race, their class, their whatever, their kind. But the narrative implications of the trope go further than just this. Typically, the reason people want to play this trope, the reason anybody would choose it, is because it allows you to explore the character idea of total isolation. Somebody who genuinely does not have anybody like them. Yes, they might have other like-minded peers, they might have other people who think the same way as them, but actually having somebody who is genuinely like them, raised in the same culture as them, is just gonna be difficult to find. See, culture is something that's very important to each and every person that lives on this planet. Culture is the entire concept of the generation that we grew up in, the concept of what we grew up in, what ideals were imposed upon us, what environment we lived through, and what different practices we had. It allows us to feel truly connected to other people, and so to have a character like this is a character who does not have a culture to go back to. And that is really an interesting deep dive, because many people want to play isolated characters. I mean, obviously, the lone wolf archetype is very popular in TTRPGs in general. And this entire archetype is basically the furthest extent of that.
Let me tell you something, Jay-Bird. Batman doesn't do ships. There is no us. Batman and Joker are not a thing. You mean nothing to me. No one does.
Not only are you a lone wolf, you literally have no one else who can fully understand who you are, what you've been through, and know where you came from. And that is very interesting. It allows you to explore isolation to its upteenth degree. Now, with that being said, obviously, there are a few different things that are going to cause problems with playing this archetype. And we'll start with the first one, originality. Let's face it, whenever we create our characters, we generally base it off of a concept we recently have enjoyed. We watch a movie, we read a book, we see a play, we watch something that gives us the idea of this character. And yes, we begin to build and expand upon it and add our own unique flair. That is the uniqueness and amazingness of storytelling and art in general. But we want it to feel original. And the fact is, when you create an archetype like this, it's really difficult to make it feel original simply because of, well, the archetypes that have come before it. Let's think about two of the most common known characters for this type of archetype, Superman and Goku.
It's Goku with the hammer. It's Goku with the hammer!
Both characters, supposedly, the last of their kind. Both characters who came from a planet that is now dead and now must figure out who they are separate from each other. Interesting, fascinating, but also two of the biggest characters that have ever existed. Dragon Ball is one of the largest franchises of all time, and Superman is one of the most recognizable characters of all time. And so when you take these two characters, who, yes, inevitably are going to be compared to each other because, let's face it, Goku's backstory was kind of based on Superman. But the point is, yeah, it's going to be really easy to feel like it's hard to be original with this because you are going to constantly be compared to other characters, which is not inevitably a bad thing, but it does make it difficult when you're trying to play an original character and everybody at the table tends to, well, compare you to somebody else. Again, Aang from Avatar is another great example. Imagine you create somebody who's from a very specific tribe of monks, and then they all died out, and now you're the last one. I mean, come on, the comparisons are there. The only reason I bring this up is to let you know it will happen. There's not really any specific advice on this because you're allowed to be compared to other characters. You're allowed to find those connections. That's how we build upon other things. So don't get discouraged if that does happen. Usually when I provide advice, I give you some sort of way of getting around this, but I don't think that's necessarily necessary in this case. Just know that it will probably happen and don't get down on yourself. Sometimes it's okay to take inspiration from other things. I mean, my channel alone is the amalgamation of basically 6 or 7 YouTubers I took inspiration from. That's just how art happens. So don't get down on yourself. But the second thing is a lot more interesting. See, yes, there's originality in all those conversations, and that's its own thing. But the second thing that causes this to be really difficult is it amplifies one of the most known problematic tropes in existence when it comes to TTRPGs that I mentioned earlier. The lone wolf, the brooding, edgy rogue sitting in the corner of the tavern. I mean, imagine somebody brings that typical brooding, edgy rogue and then amplifies it by saying, "And I'm the last of my kind. There's no one who can truly understand me." That's an issue, right? Like, that's inevitably going to lead to some sort of problems within your story, your party, your table, the whole game. And honestly, I think that that's something that is also difficult to get around. I mean, think about characters that I've mentioned before. We mentioned Superman, Goku, and Aang. All 3 of them are inevitably extremely upbeat and hopeful individuals. I don't think that's not without reason. I think the reason that that was made that way is because if you lean too heavily into being brooding and regretful of being the last of your kind, it creates a less interesting, less compelling, and less interactable character. And less interactable characters, meaning characters who it is difficult to interact and grow with, are some of the worst characters to play at a TTRPG table. Because the purpose is, you know, to tell a story with everybody else. If your character wants to isolate yourself from the story that's being told, you won't get involved. Or worse, the story will only be about you. And that's just as boring and problematic. So, I think there's a reason that all 3 of the most well-known characters for this type of trope, and there are other characters, these are just the 3 I'm mentioning, typically end up being very, very upbeat individuals. That does not mean that there is not that exploration of regret. That is there, less so with Goku, more so with Aang and Superman.
Gyatso.
But it is there. The idea of diving into that is interesting, but it only becomes more interesting and more dynamic when you are able to compare the upbeat attitude of the individual to the true tragedy that they've gone through. If the character only ever focuses on tragedy, when they begin to focus on, you know, the regret, it's less interesting. When you have that mirror, that contrast, that makes it far more entertaining. Does this mean you have to make an upbeat character? No, but it does allow you to much further contrast the interesting dilemmas that they're going to go through by choosing this trope. And the reason you choose this trope is the interesting dilemmas. I mean, why else would you want to choose this? But, you know, with all of that aside, let's dive into what the character actually goes through. I've mentioned the dilemma many times, but what does it actually look like to explore a character who is the last of their kind, especially in a TTRPG sense? Well, the first thing you're gonna have to ask yourself is, well, why did you choose the trope? Like I just mentioned a moment ago. See, the trope is commonly used to establish a character's rarity and the psychological and existential struggles that will come from their very unique status. That being said, you have to decide exactly how you're going to go through that. How do you want your character to explore that? And the thing that you have to understand is you're not going to be exploring it alone. You will have other characters at the table. And let's be honest, you're playing a TTRPG, a game where everybody's included and encouraged to make their own unique characters with unique backstories that make them stand out in the world, which means more than likely there will be at least one other person at your table who will somehow relate to this. Yes, you might be the last of your race, but they might be the last of their monastery, the last of their class, something along those lines. And so there's going to be some sort of connection, and you should prepare for that. In the session 0, find out if there's going to be any commonality between you and other characters, and that's a good thing. Don't try and avoid that. It makes it so that your character is not isolated in this instance. It is a difficult character to grow with and learn and actually progress the story with if all they ever say is, you could never understand the struggles that I've been through. You could never understand what I've gone through. That's not an interesting character. I mean, yes, it is interesting if the purpose is to break down those walls, but that would have to be discussed with players early on. Otherwise, they're just breaking a boundary. You are clearly stating that you don't want them to interact in that way with your character, so why would they, unless it's been made clear that those walls are supposed to be broken down over the course of the campaign, typically in a session 0. But outside of that, there is more to explore than just that specific part of the trope. Yes, you are the only one of your kind. But the other difficult thing that you're going to have to handle in a session 0 is the fact that the dungeon master is the one who's gonna have to build the world. If you've made your character the last of your kind, that has inevitably pigeonholed the DM into a very specific spot. Now they have to make sure nobody else in that world exists. And there are 2 ways that I've seen storytellers handle that. They have made it so that, yes, there is literally nothing else on that entire world that will ever be what you are, making it very sad because when your character is gone, so does your entire culture, race, that whole thing. Just poof, no longer there. Or on the other side of the coin, what most people do is they inevitably bring up the topic that there are more like you, which both are very interesting ways to go. One is total isolation that forces your character to come to the realization that they are the last of their culture, and how will they deal with that? But on the other hand, it forces your character to suddenly realize there are more like me. What does that mean? What does that mean for everything that I've been through up until this point? And for these topics, I would bring up yet again Superman, Goku, and Aang. See, Superman was the only one, the last son of Krypton, as he was commonly called in the old comics. However, he was not the last one. There are many other Kryptons that showed up over the course of, well, you know, comics. Comics tend to, well, jump the shark multiple times. And so you got people like his cousin, Kara, or you got people like General Zod, or you just have the random Kryptonians which would show up for 1 issue and never show up again, banished to the Phantom Zone. Meanwhile, you have the exact opposite end of the spectrum, Goku. Goku never thought that he was the only one of his kind. Well, I mean, he was unique, yes, but he didn't realize he was an alien. It wasn't until the sequel series to the original Dragon Ball that it was revealed that he was a Saiyan. And it was revealed by having another Saiyan show up, therefore never forcing him to come to the conclusion that he was the last of his kind. It was never anything that even popped up into his head.
I'm here for my brother.
Am I your brother?
Yes. I'm taking your son.
No, you're not. He took my son.
And that was its own interesting way of handling it. And that's a really cool and fun way to have a twist in your backstory. And then there's Aang. Aang knew he was the last of his kind, but he was in denial of it, which allowed him to much more interestingly explore the tropes of this, well, trope. It allowed him to explore that grief in a far more fascinating way. Any of these 3 ways of doing it are viable. You just have to decide how it's going to happen, how you're going to handle it, and leave it up to the DM to figure out. But you have to understand that you are inherently pigeonholing them. I did something very similar in the campaign that I am very, very close to bringing to an end, probably at the end of this month. When I created this campaign, I said that elves did not exist anymore. They had created this horrible phenomenon that had basically wiped them out. And then, inevitably, one of my characters approached me and said, "Hey, I'd like to play an elf." And I went, okay, I don't say no to players, not when they're creating their characters. So let's figure this out. And when I did so, I then had to figure out what I was going to do about it. I did eventually decide that there was going to be another elf for them to interact with. Somebody who would end up being the BBEG of, well, the first arc of the campaign. And that was fun. But I didn't have to put another type in there. The reason I brought him in, the reason that he ended up being the same, well, race, is because he was actually her brother. I had a specific reason to have another elf other than just, you know, it would be interesting to add another elf in there. But there are many different ways of handling these types of things, and you have to trust your DM and work with them to understand it and to pursue it properly. One of my favorite examples of the last of your kind trope handled in a very interesting and subtle way is in the How to Train Your Dragon series. See, Toothless is supposedly the last of his kind. He is the only Night Fury, but that's never implicitly stated. It's just obviously seen that you don't ever see any other Night Furies. And as the movies progress, there are no more Night Furies, and they're clearly very rare, and so we start to wonder, is Toothless the last of his kind? And it's not until another Night Fury shows up that we actually begin to really dive into why there are less Night Furies. Your character could be the last of your kind, but it not be the whole of your character. It can be subtly implied and followed through. You could be a monstrous race, which not everybody else sees, and when anybody asks, you could just simply say, I don't know, I've never really seen anybody else like me, and just leave it at that. It leaves room for more interesting storytelling and world building and allowing the DM to build upon that without making it the full front of your character, without making it the focus. And that's okay. I think that's an interesting way of going about it. In fact, there are many different ways of going about this trope. This archetype as a whole is rich with storytelling, which is why it's so common. Because at the end of the day, there's nothing more interesting than exploring isolation while surrounded by friends. See, this is truly, in my mind, where this archetype really thrives. You are in a party. In almost any TTRPG that you play, you're surrounded by other characters. Characters who probably care about you, characters who probably watch your back, characters who you interact with, you've built camaraderie with, but at the end of the day, you are still isolated in some ways because they can never fully understand that portion of you. And this is something that we have to deal with all around. We can find people who go through similar things to us, but we will never, ever find somebody who has gone through exactly what we have. We, as humans, are unique. Each and every one of us going through our own experiences, our own lives, our own very interesting things, and that makes us so unique, so special, and so isolated. And isn't that an interesting thing to realize? That we could be surrounded by people so similar and yet so different. And there are two ways you can react to this. You could choose to feel even more isolated. You could choose to push away. You could choose to feel like nobody else will understand you. Or you could choose to realize that because we are all special, we all have something to give each other. And I think most of the time when we play these types of archetypes, this is what the ultimate conclusion is. Will our character isolate themselves? Or they realize that their isolation is not unique. They're isolated in a unique way, yes. But if everybody else is also isolated in their own unique ways, we all truly do have something to understand from each other. We all have that empathy that we can have, which makes the archetype really, really interesting. Ultimately, this is a popular trope for a reason, but it needs to be used well. I didn't really use this term until the end of the video because I didn't want to make it feel like I was throwing shade at anybody who tries to play this type of archetype, but you're just trying not to play a pick-me. You don't want to play that character who's the most interesting to the DM because you're the last one of your kind. You don't want to be the ultimate main character of everything. It's an interesting topic to explore, but it is not the only topic for your character to explore. Yes, it was interesting that Aang was the last airbender, but there was more to explore to Aang than just that. That was one part of a very interesting piece that created the whole pie. And that is why I think this topic is fascinating and can be used extremely well in the right circumstances. So go out into the world, make it your own. Never forget to play a role and listen to my wife as she gives the call to action.
Don't forget that if you get Jay to 100,000 subscribers by June, at the end of June, last day of June, because I'm not telling you my exact birthday, that you get a face reveal. Like, comment, subscribe.
Go into the comments and guess her birth date in June. I'm not going to confirm any of them, but go guess. See if you can really nail.
Know me, because there are people that know me that watch Jay's videos. You're not allowed to comment. If you comment, you're little whores.